Welcome to part 4 of the study of the Long Scroll with David Chaim Smith and Sophia Boothman. Thanks for joining us. So in part 3, we spoke about view in relation to the model of the Tzimtzum and how it utterly and completely changes the nature of reality, either by grasping at reality at its base, at its primordial base, as either a proto-substance that could be added or subtracted, or by being a natural, transparent effulgence of openness, fullness, which is purely wondrous and divine. This is the essence of the view, right? So in order to understand this in terms of what we're actually doing with conventional perception, we got to look at the model of reality that is referred to as a clipa. A clipa is essentially a grasped unit of phenomena. And as we know, in order to grasp a unit of phenomena, there have to be two parts: a grasper, a knowing subject, and some phenomena that is grasped, a known object, whether it be an idea, an emotion, a feeling or sensation, the motion of energy, or a physical thing, so-called, that is engaged by your senses. Doesn't matter. If you could define it, if you could hold it with the mind as a something, you got a clipa on your hands right there. And a clipa is defined by its skin. Literally, the word means shell. So its skin or its shell, its covering, is like a bubble, right? That contains, purportedly, the contents of its meaning. However, that's not exactly true. That's the assumption. So we got to look at different types of clipas and what they are and what they do. There are 5 different classifications for how a clipa functions that I'm going to go through, and they all pertain to anything that exists in your life. All right. If something arises that you grasp after as a something, you can assume by virtue of the fact that you're grasping at it, that it is a thing, that it is a something, that it purports to be substantial in some way. And I'm not just talking about physical matter as substance. I'm talking about the substance of how you approach your thoughts, the substance of how you approach your feelings, or the substance of even an abstract axiom, like a mathematical theorem. If you study mathematics and you have an equation and you understand it, you treat it as a mental object. You treat it as a mental thing. To you, it exists. To you, it's a substance. It's a real thing. That's the view of reification in action. And like we said in the last video, there are certain primordial assumptions that go into that substance itself is real. It's a proto-substance. It's the basis of everything. That's what we call hayuli. So there is the assumption that if something is real, that it is a substance. It is something. And if something arises, it will be in some place. And place is calculated dimensionally. In physical dimensions, we could say that there is up, down, front, back, right, left, the threefold dimensionality of physical placement, which also includes the way that we conceptualize outer space and the position of galaxies, etc., on into infinity. But it's also the dimensionality of thoughts in relation to each other in the mind, and even in a pure abstract ideal realm. That dimensional placement just refers to how associations form relationships with each other, because you can't place something dimensionally by itself. It has to be related to other things by proximity, by distance, this in relation to that, and what's over here. All of those relationships articulate the dimensional relationships or the dimensional separations between things that tell you where they are. So if you have something, guaranteed it's going to appear someplace. Once you have something in some place, the natural motion that the mind perceives will be engaged because things are changing and moving all the time. When we designate coordinates on that motion, it becomes temporality, it becomes time, because things change. And the mind has a habit of mapping out the change. What has just happened, what is about to happen, and the so-called moment of now, which you'll never find, by the way, that gives you your orientation. So if you have something, it'll appear someplace, and it'll appear at some time. Thingness, dimensionality, and temporality. This is how an associative network is made, no matter what kind it is. Now, if you have something at some place, at some time, you could think about it, and you will think about it, and you will conceptualize about it and designate it and classify it and match it up against other things. That's just what the mind does. That's part of the mind's habit. In other words, you will create a conceptual pattern to frame the construct that gives you a conceptual meaning for what you think it is. I feel this way right now in the midst of all possible other feelings, and the conceptualization of how I feel is my state. It defines me. I have an emotion. I have a sense of trepidation. I am in a scenario. It locks you into a circumstance when you conceptualize. But ultimately, all the concepts that you can form about what appears in space-time either are in your mind or are not in your mind. Either they exist or they don't exist in your mind, right? So ultimately, the end of this journey to designate conceptual meaning on reality goes as far as being or non-being. It is or it is not. And that binary dualistic stamp is what gives the mind its sense of the real from a conceptual perspective. All of these 5 categories are dependent upon the assumption that reification gives you. They're dependent on the primordial mistake of the Hayuli, the primordial sense of reality and its realness having a certain solidity or concrete quality to it. The good thing about it is that since we are practitioners who seek to alchemically transform these habits, we take that poison of conceptual associations and we don't throw it away. We don't avoid it. We don't run from it. We transform it into something infinitely more sublime. And I'll get to that in a second, but let me just check in with you, Sophia. And do you have comments or questions on these 5 categories?
So this might be an impossible question to answer, but how do you know when you're grasping? Do you just assume that you always are?
How do you know when you're grasping? When experience takes place.
Okay.
That's how you know. If there is an experience, there is an experiencer, and there is a thing or an object that defines the experience, right? It becomes a concrete event in your mind. So when you have, let's say, the most elusive kind of experience, right? Some kind of fluttering, insubstantial intuition, let's say. It's still a mental object if you could think about it. If you have experienced it, that means you have conceptualized it to some degree. And I'm not, when I say conceptualize it to some degree, I'm not necessarily talking about intellectually conceptualized it. You've conceptualized it by the fact that you've identified it. Just that alone is the evidence of conceptuality, just conceptual designation.
Doesn't take much.
No, it doesn't. Experience happens so fast and is so immediate. And again, we're not talking about a prolonged intellectual process here. We're talking about just the designation that starts whether something is or is not, and then comes the how and why and wherefore, and then the placement in space-time, and ultimately the substance of what you think just happened to you, what you just experienced. So even the most subtle kinds of experience have all 5 qualities, and we call that experience. And
so it sounds like anything short of total gnosis is you're still grasping.
that's right. Yeah,
Oh my God.
it's completely disturbing if you think about it like that. Yes, pure vision, which is just another word for gnosis, is the rarest of the rare. So obviously what we are saying is that the standard for reality in the human realm is a state of conceptual grasping. It's sort of the unavoidable consequence of being a human being.
You could see how this might be a little bit discouraging for people, and why.
Yeah.
Even if you care deeply about this subject matter and the path, it's like what you're up against to actually make any real progress is just profound. And yet, so and I'm reminded of all the previous statements you've made in prior interviews where you say only a real weirdo is into this stuff. Like you have to be pretty far out there to really try and do this, because you are literally, it's not hopeful that you'll make any kind of real breakthrough. But yet, if you're into it, you can't help yourself.
Yeah. Now this is another thing that I say all the time that people never ask me questions about, but it's pretty important to talk about. I assume, and I'm not 100% positive about this, but I assume that people with these interests are born and not made. That there is a certain sense that you will always be and have always been dissatisfied with the status quo around you. And you know deep down that there is something more. And that people like this have a sense to one degree or another that they were born in the wrong family or in the wrong place, or something's wrong, something's off. The plan as it's laid out for you is not sufficient. And I think that people are born with this configuration and either do something about it or don't do something about it. And there's different opinions on this. The opinion of Rebbe Nachman of Breslov is not this. Rebbe Nachman thinks that anybody can cultivate these qualities and that Gnostic practitioners are made and not born. Whereas, for example, in Hasidus, you get the attitude of the Chabad lineage, which believes that tzaddikim, realizers, are always born. And Rebbe Nachman says, no, you can be a tzaddik just like me.
Yeah, I think in theory that is true. It just comes down to, is that person so interested and dedicated that they're actually going to put the effort in to make that happen? And that's kind of where the born versus made comes down to, right? It's like,
I think in very simple terms, I think it comes down to what you love, right?
Yeah.
And if you love the effulgence of the infinite, if you love the natural effulgence of the Avira, the divine, you can't not be curious about it. And if you're curious, you'll pursue it, right? But if you love other things, if you're in love with the things of the world, if you're in love with things that are substantial in places and times that you can conceptualize about, that seem real to you, if you truly love what can be defined in a sense that it competes with mystical aspirations, you'll never pursue the mystical aspirations. So in my opinion, and the reason why I say that I think that practitioners are more born and not made is because really what it takes is to have no other interests And that's pretty rare. And it seems that the people that I've met that really, truly have no other interest, and I'm not talking about passing, interests in the small sense. I'm talking about the things that really move you in your life. If you are moved only by this question, the people who fall into that category seem to me to have been like that as children to a certain extent. And they were always like that. I see very little evidence that that happens to people at some point in their life after they've lived a normal life. Because something about them probably wasn't normal the whole time.
Yeah, right. I'm inclined to agree with you there. And it's one has to express profound gratitude if you're like that you come across something that really resonates and opens the door and shows you, hey, there is something you can do. There's this whole tradition around this thing that you couldn't even put words on before. But I also just quickly want, in case people are getting overly discouraged or confused here, I'd want to mention that when you said there's no other interests that compete with the divine, I think is an important point to drive home. This is not to say that if you step into an 800-year-old cathedral in Europe and are moved by the beauty of the place or the architecture, or enjoy a gorgeous sunset, something like that, this is not something that's to be disparaged. I mean, those are fine experiences to have. It's what is it that you're putting first? What's the sort of basis for why you're alive, and everything else that all the work that you put into what is it that you're trying to maximize in your life? I'm sort of tripping over my words.
No. What the point that you're making is a very good one, that anybody can make progress. And that's a definite. However, I tend to not address the progress of people. I tend to address the most radical point itself, which is for almost no one. So you're saying, but wait, anybody could listen to what you're saying and apply it to their circumstance and make progress. Yes, that's true, if they want to. However, ultimately, it leads to a place where almost no one is willing to go.
Right. Well, I mean, what I really wanted to say there was that it's, we're not asking people to become some sort of unfeeling stoic that is, you can't have enjoyment in the world, that's somehow going to, hamper your mystical progress. But it's, I'm reminded of our previous conversations about hell realms and God realms, right? Like everyone can sort of understand what a hell realm is, suffering and horror and terrible things going on. And that could really push someone to seek out meaning and seek out some sort of end in suffering. But then the God realm, which is something that people are going to be less familiar with, can be just as detrimental to the path, because you're surrounded with beautiful things and pleasure, and something that could just cause you to continue to fall back and concentrate on the objects of the world. And it can sometimes lack that push to really get someone interested in this, if they had that ability to begin with.
Well, this is why I stated in part 3, and will state again now, that the practitioner invites the scorpion to sting them over and over and over, and you take the toxins of the world, the poisons of the world, into you purposefully to go beyond their toxic effects, which are dualistic toxic effects of grasping towards what you like and running away from what you don't like. That's the toxicity. If you learn to appreciate the essential nature of what doesn't change in the midst of all that oscillation, you have alchemically transformed the poison, the dualistic poison, into an opportunity to realize non-duality in any situation or any circumstance. And if you are able to do that, you realize that the lead that you have was gold all along, that the poison is its own medicine, quite literally. So the question is, how do we do that? Well, you take the 5 categories that I've already stated: substance, place, time, concept, beingness. Each one of these can become a grasping after the God realm or a descent into the hell realm if you chase after it into whatever arises. But if you don't involve yourself in the chasing, if you appreciate and seek to understand reality in a new way, something entirely different can happen. Substance, what appears as substance, can be appreciated as substancelessness, which is just the fullness of the ground, the overflow, the natural effulgence of the open luminosity of the divine, which both knows and is known at the same time. There's no substance there. It is a fullness of openness. It's not a nothingness in the sense of a void, but there is literally no thing there. Even in physical objects, the reality of the physical object, not the qualities of the experience, but the actual deep essential reality of a physical object that appears to be physical matter, is substancelessness. This is a very radical concept, because from the view that I'm speaking about, no even single particle of substance ever existed at any time. And it also is not referring to a state of non-existence. So what appears is neither an existent nor a non-existent conclusion that the mind is drawn after. It is a vivid substancelessness that leads into this idea that I call pure vision, purely alchemically transformed vision. So if thingness can be appreciated in a substanceless manner, then we know that whatever appears is not actually appearing anywhere. It is non-dimensional. It is placeless. Because think about it, where is a place? What is a place? A place only has meaning relationally to other designated points. If you take away the meaning of designated relationships and designated points, if you stop conceptualizing about where things are, place evaporates because there's nothing real about it. It's just a relational set of conceptual designations that lead to some grasped conclusion. If you stop doing that, the substancelessness of the appearance of things will reveal itself to be non-dimensional. And if it's non-dimensional, it's also atemporal. It's without time. If it's without place, it's also without time. The moment in which the natural effulgence of translucency and transparency presents itself is nothing, nowhere, at no time, but yet it appears like magic. And that's the essence of magic, is holding reality as this vivid, bright and luminous apparition, which includes the sum total of all knowing and all things that are known. And if the fullness of this vision without place and time reveals itself, we can also understand that the nature of its revealing, the luminosity of its revealing, is actually the same luminosity that beholds it, that what appears and what engages the appearance, meaning the appearance and awareness itself, are the same light, a light without place or time or substance. That in itself is the essence of non-conceptuality, that reality itself is non-conceptual because its light transcends something and nothing, or the dualistic aspect of nothing that is defined by the negation of something. Because there's two meanings to the word nothingness. We could talk about a no thingness in the non-dual sense, or we could talk about ordinary nothingness, which is just the absence of somethingness, right? So pure vision is magical vision. Pure vision is Gnostic visionary apprehension of reality. It's immersion in the divine. This is the nectar that we cultivate alchemically from the sting of the poison of the serpent or the scorpion. You could use serpent as well as scorpion. That's another distinction for another time. So in service of keeping these episodes fairly short, let's hear your concluding comments, and then we'll end it. And the last section of what we see in front of us will be number 5 part. You have any concluding remarks here?
It seems to me that you could call a clipa this sort of orientation habit. It's that they're synonymous with each other to some degree. Would you say that that's correct?
Oh yeah, the orientation habit is conceptual association, right? Conceptual association, which is based on designating meanings for units.
Yeah, this
units,
unit maker.
Right, unit designation. Something, and remember what I said about thingness and substance. We're not just talking about physical substance, it's also mental objectification, right? Something always asserts itself at some place, at some time, with some conceptual explanation, which is its designation, that determines whether it is or is not. That's what makes something conventionally viable. And it applies even to totally abstract languages, like what's studied in a university in the ideal realm. Plato mentioned it in his discussion of the ideal, right? Plato, in a sense, was not referring to non-dual visionary mysticism, although there was a metaphysics associated with Plato's system. It fell short of mysticism, at least overtly, in the writings. This was hashed out later by the Neoplatonists, and there were other levels of meaning that were possible. But I'm addressing the surface of what we see in the Republic, for example. So let's stop part 4, and I will bid you all farewell in anticipation of seeing my wonderful audience again through the other side of the window of the video in part 5. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.